اسمي عهود البلوشي، سأدير هذه الجلسة السادسة من مؤتمر الجمعية الخليجية للتربية المقارنة، والتي تناقش محور استخدام التعليم لتعزيز الإدماج والذكاء العاطفي وحل النزاعات. أحب أن أذكر الحضور بأنهم يمكن أن يستمعوا إلى اللغة العربية أو الإنجليزية من خلال الضغط على زر Interpretation في أسفل الشاشة. معنا اليوم 4 باحثين يقدمون 3 أوراق عمل حول تعزيز الإدماج والذكاء العاطفي وحل النزاعات من خلال تجارب مدرسية في دول الخليج العربية وكندا أعتقد. كل باحث سيكون لديه 15 دقيقة، وفي النهاية سيكون لدينا 15 دقيقة للأسئلة والأجوبة. نبدأ مع الورقة الأولى والتي هي بعنوان Citizenship and Peace Learning in Muslim Majority Context, Understandings of Lived Social Conflicts from Bangladeshi Schools. يقدمها is presented by Dr. Ahmed Kaderi, and he has completed, Dr. Kaderi completed his PhD in Curriculum Studies and Teacher Development from the University of Toronto. He currently serves as a member of the Department of Linguistics and Languages in the Faculty of Humanities at McMaster University. Dr. Ahmed, you have 15 minutes, and I'll be reminding you when you're near to the time up. I hope you all stick to the time limit that we have.
Thank you. I'll do my best to keep the time. Welcome everyone to this session, where I will actually be talking about some issues with citizenship learning around conflict and peace from one of my PhD thesis chapters that focused on students' lived experience and what they learned in school. Well, the study was actually folded around these 3 questions. They're self-explanatory questions, so I won't go very detailed into them. The only thing I want to focus here is just to look at how I phased it into in a triangular model, so I could understand what was there in the mandated curriculum that was mandated by the government, and the teachers were following them. And the other side of the study was what the students thought they experienced in their society, so lived experience of conflicts, and how they learned from their lived experience about how to solve conflicts and build peace. And on the other hand, the other corner, it was what the implemented curriculum taught them. So the main purpose was actually to look at the gaps or the bridges between students' lived experience of conflict and social conflict, actually. That includes everything from family to politics, with what they were taught in school and how they could be solved. The conceptual framework that I used in this research was actually adapted from political science, and along with scholars like Bush and Saltarelli and Lynn Davis. I also believe that schools could have dual rules, for example, by teaching justice, equity, and citizenship participation, ways of forming democracy and solving conflicts without exacerbating violence. School could contribute to peace building, while on the other hand, ignoring these factors and also teaching cultural factors that that validate or legalize or glorify violence, or even ignore peace building opportunities, and schooling opportunities that actually rebuild or reproduce social inequalities and cultural beliefs that those inequalities are okay. Those kind of simple issues contribute to the idea of reproducing violence from schooling. Citizenship. So you can see a triangular model I used here. The reason I have peace at the top and justice in the middle is, if you try to shrink this triangle, and if you move up the social conflicts and citizenship parts toward the justice issues, then you see you move closer to peace. So the idea here that I want to show is you cannot separate the idea of citizenship, like citizens' participation in solving problems and doing things democratically. And you cannot separate all those things also from social conflicts and say we achieve peace. Then it's going to be negative peace, in which we stop talking about problems. We stop staying away from, we stop going into violence and trying to solve problems. And all this is related to justice, how justice is affirmed in day-to-day life or not. So basically, the idea of peace building then is affirming, solving conflicts, reducing violence, and affirming justice in day-to-day affairs, starting from family, personal life, to governance, let's say. So that's very briefly the conceptual framework. And methodology is self-explanatory. I won't go very detailed here. As you can see that I used the document analysis model. This is kind of hermeneutic, but I tried to stay with the critical framing of the encoding of the texts. And then I used 2 rounds of focus group workshops in which I chose comparable cities in Bangladesh, because I was also working in a similar project in Toronto. That was my background. I had about 6 schools that I was working in the city of Toronto. For Bangladesh, that was my actually PhD research. I chose 4 schools from 2 comparable cities. One was a relatively affluent city in which you would see lots of structural and sometimes physical violence. And on the other hand, I chose a non-affluent city in which you would see students were marginalized in many ways. So that I could compare the findings from one context with the other. It had a teacher focus group workshop, which was 120 minutes, in which from each school, I chose 3 to 5 teachers. And I asked them questions about what their understandings of social problems were in their society and what they thought their students needed to know about, and what they taught in schools from what they understood the opportunities in the textbook they were following were. And later on, they were asked to choose some students for me that they thought they would represent the curriculum they taught very well. And I gave them criterias, like not giving them the best students so far, but giving them giving me students from a different social range, like privileged families, less privileged families, religious differences, and all those. So that was the first round, and it happened in 2015. And the follow-up workshops that I call a member check-in, but it was really to affirm and share some of my findings with them, but also affirm from a different group of students whether the concerns in the society have changed. So that was in 2017 January. So it was a little bit shorter than the first round. It was 60 to 90-minute teacher focus group workshops with the same teachers, but 60 to 90-minute student focus group workshops with different set of students. And as I said, the analysis was coding and thematic analysis of patterns. And did I jump? Yes. So the findings, this is the most interesting part. Students' understandings of conflict was in most of the cases purely based on their lived experience, meaning what they experienced in the society. And they included 3 broad types of conflicts. I'll share 2 with you today. Well, actually, I will go in one simple issues, but if I can categorize them as human rights conflicts, in which they talked about gender, resource, and religious conflicts, and There were cultural issues like social inclusion issues, identity, and all those. I didn't mention them here for the sake of time. And the other big one was governance conflict. So it started, it's not only politics with the capital P, but it was like school governance as well. And then the political polarization that I think most of you may know Bangladesh experiences. So as a Muslim majority context, the students' concerns were actually centered on those ideas of Islam. And they would say those conflicts are unreal in an ideal Muslim community, right? But they ironically happen to be the biggest concern for them for that time. Now, all those understandings were tied to the social, structural, and cultural factors in the society. So the factors that you wouldn't see as much if you look at a society that experiences imperfect democracies, for example, Bangladesh. And their actors and their interests and the direct and indirect dimensions of the factors also come into play when it comes to the solutions of the same conflicts. So what I understood from their concerns is they actually could name some of those factors. So which is a matter of hope if I take you back to this conceptual framework, because when we go in the lower left corner with social conflicts, so social conflicts, we understand social conflicts in this research not as overgeneralizing term. We understand conflict as different from violence, in which conflict is a symptom of the problems and violence is an exacerbated form, and they have different social layers. So the violence could be, let's say, as Johan Galton would categorize them, in direct physical violence, in which you can see the perpetrator and the damage. And sometimes weapons are involved in those. However, there are two less visible dimensions of violence, which are social structural dimensions and cultural dimensions that you would experience or believe or see people believe, but it won't be able to see them as much. So those are indirect dimensions of social conflict. So bringing them here, students' understandings were centered on these ideas for sure. They did talk about conflicts and their different dimensions, and also they talked about the solutions. Because if we talk about social conflicts in the left corner of the triangle, from all those dimensions, citizenship also needs to address all those dimensions and for solving the problems and affirming justice and reaching the top angle of the triangle, which is peace. So moving forward, let's take one example of how the students understood gender-based conflicts in Bangladesh and their solutions, so we can get an idea of what we mean by that. So here I have direct physical dimension at the top, not because it's our goal to reach direct or only address direct physical dimensions of the conflict, but because the students and the teachers, and ironically the curriculum, that the documents that were taught, like the textbooks, they all heavily focused on direct physical dimensions. And I'm not blaming them, because this is how the world goes. Whenever you talk about conflicts, it's like it's a cliche. People will understand. Some people, even I have spoken with the leaders of great NGOs, like I don't want to name them for the sake of privacy. Let's say one of the world's biggest NGOs. I spoke with the founder of the NGO, and I asked them about situations in that country. They would say, we don't have any conflict in our country. Whereas if you just use this conceptual framework, all you will see is conflict. So this happens with my students as well, student and teacher participants, and the curriculum as well, because conflict is basically understood as a direct physical issue in which people fight and kill each other.
Dr. Ahmed, you have 2 minutes to wrap up your main idea, please.
I have only 2 minutes?
Yep.
All right, that'll be plenty. So yes, the social structural dimensions, the inequality issues, education issues, they were mentioned, and also the cultural dimensions, like what was believed about women, whether they are as important as men in society, whether their roles should be as important as men in the society. All those factors are important, and students somehow mention them. However, the dominant ideas were still around the physical dimension issues. And I have justice-oriented understanding of conflict in the middle, because that is where the solution comes. From a Muslim majority context, students did name them, but they named them within the fold of the Quran, within the fold of Islam. So they mentioned Islam as the overarching solution, without being able to connect them always to the social structural dimensions and cultural dimensions they mentioned. They were mostly connected with the direct dimensions. Same with the solutions. Since they talked about conflict in terms of direct dimensions mostly, their idea of peace building was also, like, most of the time they would give one answer: Islam is the solution for everything. I agree, yes. However, you need to articulate how you apply Islam where, and what elements of them would solve what problems. So in those cases, they would mostly go with direct physical dimensions like acid throwing, beating up, and all those issues. And then they would mostly ignore the social structural dimensions and cultural dimensions, even for solutions as well. So teachers were a little bit different. They were talking about structural issues a little bit more, but however, their main concerns were also direct dimensions. So there's a social chain, because in the lived experience, you see well, I cannot say because, but it's correlated to the social situation in which you see that it's dominantly physical dimensions that you can see in the society. Their learning in school were also shaped by that understanding or experience in the society. So that's part of my theory, that lived experience does shape how students understand conflict and their solutions, and vice versa, for sure. That's where schooling comes. So I will. So the key finding is a paradox. Then, at one point you talk about Islam and being Muslims, but at the other point, we don't know how to affirm that. So that's a paradox. So even Islam becomes a cultural knowledge in that sense.
Thank you,
So,
Dr. Ahmed, your time is up. I will have to stop you here. And perhaps in the question and answer, you can shed some more light on the relationship between the lived experience and what students expect as conflicts. Thank you very much, Dr. Kaderi, for a very interesting presentation. We now move to our second presenters. Dr. Navid Bakali. He has completed his PhD in Educational Studies from McGill University in Canada, and he's currently an assistant professor of education at the American University in Dubai. The co-presenter, Dr. Mariam Alhashmi, she's an assistant professor as well in the College of Education at Zayed University, and she has extensive expertise in the areas of education research, teacher development, and Arabic and Islamic education, teaching and learning. They're going to present a paper on intersections between school culture, curriculum, and student diversity, and making sense of the tolerance discourse in the UAE schools. Dr. Naved, please go ahead.
All right, just so that I can confirm, so can you all see my screen? And
yes.
Can you all hear me? Perfect, okay. So thank you all for your attendance here tonight, this evening. So myself, as I was introduced, I'm Navid Bakali. I'm at the American University in Dubai, and I'll be co-presenting with Dr. Mariam Alhashmi from Zayed University. And really, we're going to be talking about this idea of tolerance state discourses within Islamic education programming in the UAE. So in this presentation, we'll very briefly introduce sort of the research project that we undertook. We'll talk very briefly about the methodologies, and then we'll get into the findings of Arabic and English Islamic education classes. And we'll also be doing a short comparison and contrasting of the two sets of findings, and then we'll have our conclusions. So to begin with, I just want to very briefly touch on, what our interest is in this topic in general. Mariam and myself have been looking at Islamic education in the UAE for a number of years now. We've done a few projects and written a few papers and so on this topic. So today's presentation is really going to be focusing on one of these projects that we did, where we visited schools in a couple of emirates in the UAE, Ras Al Khaimah and Abu Dhabi. And we looked at the Islamic education curriculum, and we also looked at sort of the lived experiences of the curriculum in the classroom. And we kind of related that to the tolerance discourse in the country. Ultimately, the goal of a study like this was really to understand what was happening on the ground in the classrooms and what's being taught in the classes, and also seeing how that relates to the tolerance discourses in the UAE. Now, the United Arab Emirates, as you may be familiar, it's a country that very much prides itself in this idea of tolerance, celebrating tolerance in a state sort of discourse. And so in the UAE, for example, 2019 was the year of tolerance. A number of initiatives were taking place in this year, as well as other years in the country's history, where they try to promote this idea of tolerance. Now, the UAE is a country that's composed of over 200 nationalities, so promoting this idea of tolerance is really, it's a way to kind of manage sort of the diversity within the nation. But for those of you that are familiar with this discourse of tolerance in the UAE, it's not very clearly defined. What do we mean by tolerance, and what are some of the challenges and complexities of tolerance, and how does this manifest in the UAE? So we don't typically get into sort of the details of this discourse on tolerance. Now, if you look at tolerance as a societal value, it can be viewed on kind of a spectrum. So on one end of the spectrum, you might have, for example, this idea of suffrage. You're willing to accept the existence of another just by virtue of them being there, but not kind of no sort of meaningful interaction or dialogue or acceptance. Whereas on the other end of the spectrum, you'll have this idea of more that diversity adds value to society, and so there should be an acceptance of different cultures, different viewpoints, and so that sort of impacts and molds a society. So there's kind of like a spectrum in which tolerance exists, but we don't really get into some of those details when we talk about tolerance in the UAE, because with this idea of tolerance comes complexities and challenges. So with regards to this study, we did a qualitative content analysis. So we did an analysis of textbooks of Islamic education classes from grades 10 to 12. We did classroom observations also for grades 10 and 12 for both English and Arabic classrooms, as well as in the public and private sector of education. And then we also interviewed Islamic education teachers, both Arabic and English Islamic education teachers in the private and public systems. All right, let's move on. So very briefly, just to kind of summarize the generic themes that we derived from our data collection, these are the prominent themes that came up. So we'll talk a little bit about each of these. So number one, tolerance is a culture. Number two, pedagogies of tolerance. 3, situations that teachers considered sensitive. 4, tolerance and the level of student engagement. 5, students as active learners, and 6, deterrent from extremism. Now, this idea of tolerance, the culture of tolerance, beyond what's in the curriculum, and the curriculum makes explicit mention of tolerance, and it tries to embed it within the textbooks and the lessons. Beyond the curriculum, beyond what's happening in the classrooms, we found really that this idea of tolerance was something that was cultural within the school. So a lot of schools embodied a very sort of tolerant culture, and they sort of promoted it in different ways within their schools, whether it was events that were taking place in the school, or whether it was the makeup of the classes, the way the classes were run, and so on. And so we found that this very much related to the diversity within the school itself. In other words, the more sort of the stronger this culture of tolerance manifests in the school, it tended to be in those schools where there's more of a heterogeneous sort of student body. There's a lot of students coming from different cultural backgrounds, different religious backgrounds, and so on. And so we found that the amount of diversity or how heterogeneous the school was impacted sort of the culture of tolerance within the school. Now, regardless of how heterogeneous or homogeneous the school, the student body was of the school, what we did find, which was an interesting point, was that teachers of both these sort of homogeneous and heterogeneous school environments, they practice this pedagogy of tolerance. Pedagogy of tolerance aims at fostering attitudes of respect, mutual understanding, and acceptance of the other. Now, this was done at varying levels, so in the school environments that were a lot more sort of heterogeneous, there was, basically what would happen is that the teachers would create spaces for their students to try to, talk about issues that were relevant to them, ask questions that they felt they could ask within the judgment-free space. And we found this as well in the homogeneous school environments, but the types of issues and the types of questions that would come up were very different. And so this kind of really was indicative of the levels of tolerance that need to be exercised within the classroom.
Dr. Navid, I think because we're dividing the session between you and Dr. Mariam, so I think the time has...
This is my last slide. I'm wrapping up.
You have less time.
All right, so in terms of when you create those spaces where you can have open questions and express your views in judgment-free spaces, sensitive issues come up, and so ultimately teachers had to kind of navigate these sort of sensitive issues, which they kind of they found difficult to manage, and at times they try to shy away from them. But ultimately, when you create a space where there's this sort of diversity of viewpoints that are able to emerge, you create these spaces that sensitive issues can come up. So I'll hand it over to Mariam to discuss the other sets of findings. So Mariam, you can go ahead. Let me stop sharing. And go ahead.
Okay, I'm sharing my slide. Okay. All right, so I'll continue with from where Dr. Naved has stopped. So this is the third theme that emerged from our study, which is how students are actually seen as active learners. So in many of the visited Islamic education classrooms, and with the change that we have, that has happened to the curriculum in the late years, we've seen that the students are given more of an active role. They initiate discussions, they have dialogues with their teachers, and sometimes they can disagree with the teachers at a certain level, especially in schools that embody the tolerant culture, as Dr. Navid shared. Another theme is also the relationship between tolerance and the level of student engagement. Teachers in their interviews expressed that they strive to nurture this level of high student engagement, and they try to have to do this through active learning strategies. So we've seen this. We've seen a lot of open discussion. We've seen a lot of technology integration, group work happening. For example, there were questions like this teacher would ask the students to conclude a meaning from a verse, to compare, contrast, solve problems using text, explain sometimes. But we also noticed that there is disengagement with the content in many of the visited classes. So for example, the students will be not engaged, but a better word to describe the situation is that they will be busy doing busy work. So filling out textbook pages or filling in the blanks, for example. And so there was actually a distance between the students and the content. And the level of discussion in those classes was more of a superficial level, which aimed at just decoding the text without really engaging in a deep and a reflective level with the text. And that is related to tolerance, because we don't want the students to stop at a literal level. Which then poses the question of whether this is the case in traditional classes, but a study of the tradition shows that, on the contrary, there was a lot of traditional classes involve a lot of logical thinking, critical thinking, and deep analysis and engagement with the text. So that's not necessarily brought from this aspect. Another theme that emerged and was described by the teacher as well as in the classrooms was that of deterrent from extremism. And we know that protection is very critical, very important for students. And this was done through citizenship values, nurturing values like belonging, also discussing the relationship between religion and other worldly issues like economy, environment, sustainability. All of these came up, and they are elements that protect students from being attracted by extreme movements, and actually makes them less vulnerable to such propagandas. And in general, the teachers were confident that the students were far from extremism, but they also stressed that it's important to keep nurturing this awareness in the students from the teachers, from the school, and also from the community. So let's talk about the key takeaways from this work. I'm going to focus on three dimensions, which are teaching about tolerance, teaching for tolerance, and teaching through tolerance. And we argue that the Islamic education curriculum in the UAE is well established in the first two, but there are opportunities for development in the third. So what we mean by teaching about tolerance is those lessons that are dedicated and explicitly teach about tolerance. There are many of these lessons in the textbooks across all grade levels. Students learn a lot of times, repeatedly, they learn what tolerance is, what is extremism, conflict resolutions. These topics keep coming up in the curriculum. Teaching for tolerance also has been given weight in the curriculum, so the students learn different topics that lead them to tolerance, not directly, but in an indirect way. Like, for example, when they learn what is authentic religiosity, for example, where to get religious information from, when they learn about national belonging, rational thinking. These are all means that lead to tolerance. Now, where we have an opportunity for development is in the area of teaching through tolerance, which is the ways teaching and learning and pedagogies are in the classroom. So as I have mentioned, there are gaps in the way Islamic education is taught in the classroom, and by maximizing on those opportunities, there will be a better inculcation or teaching, nurturing of tolerance in the future generations. So in conclusion, we talked about we talked about opportunities for deeper levels of engagement, for reflection, critical thinking, and close engagement with the Islamic education materials through pedagogies for tolerance. The teachers will need to achieve this level, they will need access to quality and authentic materials and resources, and that's an area that where there is a huge lack in the Islamic education area. And then the teachers also will need training that is customized to support them in teaching for tolerance, training about pedagogies for tolerance, and how to use the textbooks in ways that achieve the desired purpose. I'll stop here, and we will be happy to answer any questions or to provide any additional details.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mariam and Dr. Naved. It's been a very, very interesting topic and presentation, and I really enjoyed it myself. Can I just announce that I can see some people have raised their hand. If you have any questions, you can write them in the Q&A down. So the presenters will have a look at them and try and answer them after we finish our last presentation. Our third presenter is Dr. Mariam Alhashmi. Dr. Zainab AlAjmi. She's an educational researcher at the General Directorate of Curriculum Development. She obtained her PhD from Sultan Qaboos University in Oman in curricula and teaching, and specialized in preparing studies and research in the field of curricula. Her presentation is entitled, it will be in Arabic, it's entitled Strategies to Integrate Emotional Intelligence into Curricula. And please to follow the English translation, press on interpretation and choose English. دكتورة زينب عندك 15 دقيقة.
إن شاء الله. شكراً دكتورة عهود، أتشرف بإدارتك لهذه الجلسة، إدارة جداً جيدة وممتازة. كما أني أشكر الGCC على المشكلة التي حصلت، لأني واجهت مشكلة كبيرة في الدخول، فالحمد لله finally I get in. So let's get started because only we have 15 minutes. طيب دكتورة عهود، العرض واضح؟ طيب طبعا هذا التصور استراتيجيات دمج مهارات الذكاء العاطفي في المناهج الدراسية، هذا تصور مقترح نبع من دراسة تجريبية أجريتها في 2019 لطروحة الدكتوراه. كان بحث تجريبي عن دمج مهارات، عن استراتيجيات التدريس بالذكاء العاطفي، وكانت النتائج جدا ممتازة. فكتطوير للدراسة ما بعد الدكتوراه أجريت تصورا مقترحا على المناهج الدراسية العمانية. طبعا بداية سيكون يعني محور العرض سيكون عن الذكاء العاطفي بصورة عامة، تعريفه ومكوناته، عن الاستراتيجية الوطنية للتعليم، وعن التطبيقات الوظيفية وهو محور الدراسة في مجال المناهج، ونماذج وتطبيقات من المناهج الدراسية العمانية قمت بتفعيل فيها استراتيجيات الذكاء العاطفي. أثبتت الدراسات وبعد البحث الذي أجريته في دراستي في الدكتوراه أن 80% من الناس يمتلكون ذكاء عاطفيا emotional intelligence، لكن بينما الذكاء المعرفي يحتل نسبة 20%، وذلك يعني هذه النسب هي لأجل النجاح في الحياة والنجاح في العمل، وليس لأجل النجاح في البيئة المدرسية. لكن البيئة المدرسية حسب ما بينت الدراسات أنها تحتاج أكثر من الذكاء المعرفي بنفسه، إنما تحتاج إلى ذكاء عاطفي، أو تحتاج إلى مشاعر، إلى تفعيل المشاعر والوجدانيات في أثناء التدريس. كيف يتم ذلك؟ سنرى من خلال عرض مكونات ومهارات الذكاء العاطفي. من مهارات علينا أن نعرف أولاً ما هي مهارات ومكونات الذكاء العاطفي التي ينبغي على المعلم وكذلك المناهج الدراسية أن توظفها وتفعلها في البيئة المدرسية. أول مكون من مهارات الذكاء العاطفي هو الوعي بالعواطف، بمعنى أن يكون الفرد مدركاً لحالته النفسية. ثاني مكون مهارة تنظيم الذات أو مهارة تنظيم العواطف، وهي قدرة الفرد على تحويل المشاعر السلبية إلى مشاعر إيجابية، بحيث لا يسمح للمشاعر السلبية أن تسيطر عليه. المكون الثالث الدافعية، وهي كيف يمكن للفرد أن يحافظ على هدفه long time، يعني long life، يعني هدف طويل الأمد. كيف يمكن لي أن أحقق أهداف وطموحات، خاصة إن كانت طويلة الأمد لا تتأثر بمصاعب الحياة، لا تتأثر بمشكلات الحياة؟ كيف يمكن للفرد أن يستمر ويبقي نفسه في حالة دائمة من الإيجابية والقدرة على مقاومة الإحباط ومواجهتها؟ المكون الرابع، المكون الرابع هو مهارة التعاطف، ويعني المشاركة الوجدانية. التعاطف هو فهم ومشاركة الآخرين في مشاعرهم وعواطفهم وإدراكهم والتصرف وفق هذه المعرفة، بمعنى أنني أعلم أن من يجلس بجانبي هو في حالة فرح، أو أنا أعلم أن من يجلس بجانبي هو في حالة سرور، وهكذا. المكون الخامس المهارات الاجتماعية. ما ذكرنا سابقا هي مهارات فردية، من مهارة الوعي بالذات أو تنظيم الذات أو تحفيز الذات، هذه مهارات فردية. تأتي من المكون الخامس من المهارات الذكاء العاطفي المهارات الاجتماعية. من المعلوم أن ضعف المهارات الاجتماعية هو سبب فشل العلاقات المتبادلة بين الأشخاص، وأغلب القادة والزعماء والمسؤولين ومن يمسك زمام الأمور لديهم مهارات اجتماعية، بحيث لديهم القدرة على الاتصال مع الآخرين وإدارة الصراعات، والقدرة على قيادتهم وإحداث التغيير المطلوب، وبناء قدرات الفريق، وبناء روابط اجتماعية، ثم التأثير بينهم أو ثم التأثير عليهم. لماذا تم دراسة الذكاء العاطفي؟ طبعاً انطلقت من الرؤية 2040 للسلطنة. هذه الرؤية طبعاً لو من يطلع عليها نجد أنها قد ركزت في الاهتمام بتنمية الموارد البشرية بما يمكنها من العيش بصورة فاعلة في العالم المتسارع اقتصادياً، معرفياً، تكنولوجياً، وأن تحافظ السلطنة على هويتها، ويحافظ الأفراد الذين يعيشون فيها على هويتهم وقيمهم الأصيلة. أيضاً التركيز انصب خلال العقود الماضية، لو لاحظنا في بعض الأبحاث والدراسات أو من خلال استقراء للواقع، على أن فيما سبق من الجانب التعليمي تم التركيز على الناحية المعرفية فقط للمتعلم، مع إهمال وإغفال الجانب العاطفي، والذي أثبتت الدراسات فاعليته بالنسبة للمتعلم في أثناء عملية تعلمه. من هنا ظهرت الحاجة إلى تفعيل استراتيجيات وأدوات تعليمية تسمح للمتعلمين بأن يأخذوا الجانب المعرفي مع عدم إغفال الجانب الوجداني، بل وتحقيقه بما يسهم في تحقيق رؤية 2040 وتفعيل الاستراتيجيات الخاصة بالمعايير الوطنية للتعليم والمناهج في استثمار قدرات المتعلمين المعرفية والعاطفية. طبعا صنفت مهارات الذكاء العاطفي على أنها من أهم مهارات المستقبل. هذه طبعا إحصائية على أساس أن المؤتمر كان سيتم في 2020. طبعا هذه كانت 10 مهارات هي الأهم في 2020 لفرص توظيفية أكثر ولنجاح في العمل والحياة، لكن اكتشف فيما بعد أن هي من ضمن مهارات الحياتية لمهارات المستقبل التي يحتاج إليها المتعلمون. قبل أن أدخل في كيفية توظيف الذكاء العاطفي في المنهج المدرسي، علينا أن نعلم، كوني خبيرة في المناهج المدرسية، أن المنهج له محتويات وله عناصر، فإما أن يتكون من معرفة أو مفهوم أو يعالج قضية أو مشكلة، ويتم تقييم هذه القضية والمعرفة والمفهوم عبر نشاط، وكذلك يعمل المنهج على تطوير مهارات المتعلمين وقدراتهم، ثم على تكوين اتجاهات ومواقف وميول. طبعا هذه لن تتم، خاصة بما يتعلق بالاتجاهات والمواقف والميول، لن تتم تفعيلها ما لم يتحقق الجانب العاطفي في العملية التعليمية. أيضاً أعرض هنا نموذج عالمي لإحدى المدارس أو لإحدى الهيئات والمؤسسات العالمية التي تبنت موضوع الذكاء العاطفي. لو أتينا هنا إلى الويب سايت، إلى موقع CASEL، وهذه الهيئة أو المنظمة يعني كان هدفها أنها تعمل على تنمية الذكاء العاطفي والمهارات الاجتماعية لدى المتعلمين. طبعاً هي هيئة أكاديمية وتعليمية توفر للمتعلمين طريقة التدريس الخاصة بعملية الذكاء العاطفي، وكما نلاحظ هنا بأنها يعني تقبل من ينتسب إليها، والتدريس فيها قائم على أساس الذكاء الوجداني والذكاء العاطفي. لديها أنشطة في هذا الجانب، أي أن التعليم في هذه الهيئة وفي هذه المؤسسة الأكاديمية قائم على أو ينطلق من المهارات الوجدانية والمهارات العاطفية. طيب، استراتيجيات دمج. نأتي للجانب العملي أو الأمثلة التطبيقية. هنا استعرض نماذج لكيف يمكن أن ندمج مهارات الذكاء العاطفي في المناهج الدراسية، ثم سأستعرض نتيجة للتطبيق لهذه الاستراتيجيات. مثلا في كتاب العلوم للصف العاشر لديهم درس عن بنية المادة والتركيب الإلكتروني لها، وكان من خلال بنية المادة والتركيب الإلكتروني لها هناك درس منطلق منه عبارة عن اختيار الطالب لمهنة في المستقبل. طبعا حتى يختار الطالب المهنة التي تناسبه في المستقبل لا بد من أن يتم تنمية ميول واتجاهات معينة، وهذه تحتاج إلى استراتيجية تدريس. استخدمنا إحدى استراتيجيات التدريس من الذكاء العاطفي، وهي الخاصة بإعداد خريطة مفاهيم. بعد خريطة المفاهيم هناك تم توزيع بطاقة المشاعر لهم. البطاقة الأولى تتحدث عن ما أهدافك وطموحاتك في الحياة. كانت البطاقة الثانية هل تشعر أنك بحاجة إلى واحدة من هذه المهن، ويعطي مثال من خلال المهن الموجودة لديه في الكتاب. أيضا في البطاقة المشاعر الثالثة صف شعورك حول أهمية مهنة معينة، مثل أخصائي علم السموم. ما هو شعورك؟ ما أهمية هذه المهنة؟ بحيث يعرف الطالب من خلال ميوله واتجاهاته كيف يصل للمهنة المناسبة له، هل هي تلائمه، هل هي تتفق مع رغباته، هل هي تتفق مع اتجاهاته، وهكذا بالنسبة لبقية النشاط. مثلا أخذنا مثال عن الدراسات الاجتماعية في الوحدة الثالثة، هناك لديهم درس عن العمل الاجتماعي. طبقنا استراتيجية القبعة الحمراء أو التفكير العاطفي. طبعا استراتيجية القبعة الحمراء هي استراتيجيات تابعة لمدرسة دي بونو. طبعا القبعة الحمراء تمثل في هذه المدرسة على أنها التفكير العاطفي. في هذا الدرس أو في هذه المادة طبقنا أن كل طالب يلبس القبعة الحمراء، ومن خلال ما هو يلبس القبعة الحمراء يجاوب على النشاط الموجود في صندوق للأنشطة. هذا الصندوق إما أن يكون على شكل بطاقة يوزعها المعلم، أو تكون مكتوبة على السبورة المدرسية، أو تكون عبارة على أوراق عمل تقدم للطالب. ثم أثناء ما هو يجيب على هذه الأنشطة وهو يرتدي القبعة الحمراء لها تأثيرها، وقد اتضح فعلا تأثيرها أثناء عملية البحث التجريبي أو أثناء ما تم التطبيق الحقيقي للتجربة. في مادة المهارات الحياتية، من المعلوم أن مادة المهارات الحياتية غنية بتطبيقات حياتية وواقعية من حياة المتعلمين. فكان لديهم درس عن احترام الذات، فقمنا باستخدام استراتيجية تدريس هي تقويم الذات، بحيث أن الطالب يستطيع أن يقيم نفسه، هل هو الآن مثلا في حالة فرح، رضا، سرور، في حالة قلق، وإلى آخره. وتم يعني كتابة بعض المشاعر مثل القلق أو العصبي أو الطيب أو الأناني أو المتفهم، ثم وضع نشاط. من خلال النشاط الذي يقرأ يختار الصفة المناسبة. هنا يتم دراسة المشاعر التي يمر بها المتعلم أثناء ما يتم شرح هذا الدرس. مثلا اختر من الصفات السابقة صفات تجعل من سيرتك حسنة بين زملائك. تخيل في السؤال الثاني، تخيل نفسك بأنك شخصية سلبية سريعة الغضب، كيف تكون سيرتك بين زملائك؟ كيف تكون مشاعرك؟ ما أهمية ضبط الإنسان مشاعره الذاتية وحسن إدارتها؟ هنا يتم تفعيل جميع المشاعر التي يمتلكها الطلاب. طبعا في هذه المادة تم تقسيم الأنشطة ما بين أنشطة صفية وأنشطة تقويمية لا صفية. في مادة اللغة الإنجليزية كان عندهم درس خاص بالتواصل في الكوميونيكيشن. هذا الدرس كان عبارة عن أن يسمع الطالب لحديث أو لمشاعر تدور بين زملاء أو بين مجموعة من الطلاب. من عنوان الدرس Look, Listen and Write. طبعا يستمع المتعلم. طلبنا من المتعلم في هذه التجربة أن يتأمل ذاتياً، والهدف هو تنمية مهارة الوعي بالذات. فهو يستمع إلى مقطع صوتي ويختار التعبير الانفعالي المناسب من خلال الوجوه المعروضة أمامه، في happy، في bored، في scared، في excited، في angry، في tired، في sad. يختار المتعلم ما يناسب من مشاعر حسب من وجهة نظره، حسب ما يميل إليه. ليس هناك موجه معين، بل إن الطالب هو من يتحكم في عملية اختيار هذه الانفعالات. في مادة أيضاً الرياضة المدرسية هناك تطبيق لهذه المادة. في عندهم درس اسمه ألعاب البراعة الحركية. تقريباً هذا الدرس للصف الثاني من التعليم الأساسي، في نشاط جماعي، والهدف من النشاط الجماعي تنمية المهارات الاجتماعية، خاصة قيمة التعاون. المعروف أن اللعب لا يتم بصورة فردية وإنما يتم بصورة جماعية. هنا يجب في هذا النشاط بالذات علينا أن نفعل عملية التعلم الجماعي وغرس قيمة التعاون. وهنا تأتي أهمية بناء الفريق، أهمية تكوين الروابط الاجتماعية بين المتعلمين. طبعا يعني يستخدم
عندك دقيقة ونص فقط
إن شاء الله تعالى. خلاص، هذه طبعا شريحة قبل الأخيرة قبل أن أعرض النتائج والمقترحات. في هذا النشاط المطلوب من المتعلمين العمل الجماعي والتعاوني، ثم التنافس الشريف، ثم كيف يعبروا عن فرحتهم بتحقيق النجاح في الأداء، وأن يتقبل خسارته الخاصة ويتقبل نجاح الآخرين. طبعا هذه قيمة مهمة، يتقبل المتعلم خسارته ويتقبل كذلك نجاح الآخرين. بعد تطبيق الدراسة التجريبية أنا أعطيكم يعني متغير واحد فقط، أن اكتشفنا بعد تطبيق استراتيجيات الذكاء العاطفي أن هناك ارتفاع ملحوظ في اختبار مهارات التفكير العليا الذي طبق على الطلاب. هذا التأثير وصل بنسبة 45% بعد عزل أثر التطبيق القبلي من التجربة البحثية. أخيرا، مقترحات وتوصيات عامة. إن استثمار مهارات المتعلمين العاطفية، طبعا هذه المقترحات جاءت من الدراسة ومن التصور. استثمار مهارات المتعلمين العاطفية والوجدانية في تطوير وتنمية مهارات القرن 21 والذكاء الاصطناعي يجعل منهم متعلمين فاعلين ومنتجين في وظائف المستقبل الذي يحتاج إلى مهارات معينة، وطبعا بما يحقق رؤية 2040 أو تسعى إلى تحقيقه. تحسين كفاءة المتعلمين المعرفية يتم من خلال التركيز على الأنشطة والخبرات التي تتطلب تفعيل مهارات التفكير جنباً إلى جنب مع مهارات الذكاء العاطفي. تحقيق التكامل بين المهارات العاطفية والتفكير بأنواعه في أثناء تدريس المتعلمين يجعل من المتعلمين في حالة دافعية دائمة بما ينمي خبراتهم ويجعلهم يعني لهم قدرة على التأثير في الآخرين، وأيضا يستطيع المعلم أن يحقق الأهداف المرجوة. أخيراً، يؤدي الذكاء العاطفي دوراً مهماً لا ينبغي إغفاله في العملية التعليمية وفي تحقيق الأهداف التعلمية، كما أن له وظيفة فاعلة في عملية تعلم المتعلمين لا تقل عن أهمية اكتساب المهارات والمعارف الأخرى. شكراً جزيلاً لكم، وأشكرك دكتورة عهود، وأشكر أعضاء ومنظمي اللجنة.
شكرا كثير دكتورة زينب. Thank you very much. Now we have less than 10 minutes for question and answers. Please, I can see one question here. There is a question for Dr. Mariam.
Yeah, so I guess we can maybe each take a shot at it, and then we'll try to do it quickly. So I think very briefly to answer the question, Janan, is that you're asking, do you know how...
translator, الصوت مال translation طالع.
It's okay, can I go?
لا الصوت الترجمة طاغي على الهاي technical. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, so just to I guess to address the question, so basically, do you know how teachers were prepared to teach the tolerance curriculum? How is a shared sense of definition of tolerance? So basically, the teachers were not really prepared to teach this concept, and that's kind of what we were getting from them for the most part, is that they felt very ill prepared to teach this subject, and so that's kind of why we felt that professional development was so essential, because it's an important topic. Students feel it's important, but teachers were ill prepared to be able to engage with it, and because they were ill prepared, there wasn't much of nothing beyond really a surface level discussion of what tolerance is, and so that's kind of addressing the second issue in terms of this shared definition. It's just kind of more of a tagline than it is an actual meaningful sort of discussion. It's just more of a surface level discussion on the topic. Mariam, if you want to add something to that.
Yeah, so when we talk about tolerance, it's really a broad spectrum of definitions. It's not one definition, and we take this to the epistemological frameworks that the word or the definition is based on. So that definitely teachers indicated that they do need professional development in this regard, and not only in understanding the concept of tolerance, because this was provided in certain workshops after our research to teachers, but really on how to infuse the culture of tolerance in their classrooms in action.
دكتورة عهود، هناك سؤال في ال Q&A من أستاذة سلوى، يعطيكم العافية على العروض المهنية. سؤالي عن الذكاء العاطفي، كيفية توظيفه في مهارات التدريس الصفي. طبعا أنا في تجربتي البحثية، بعد إذنك دكتورة عهود أجاوب. أيوة، في تجربتي البحثية أيوة من عند سلوى سؤال، أيوة Q&A أجاوبها دكتورة. هو سؤال عن شكرا جزيلا. سؤالها كيفية توظيفه في مهارات التدريس الصفي. هناك مهارات التعلم النشط. مهارات التعلم النشط قائمة على استراتيجيات معينة أو قائمة على طرائق وأساليب تدريسية معينة، نختار منها ما هو متعلق بالمشاعر، مثلا القبعة الحمراء، بطاقة مثلا المشاعر، استراتيجيات تقويم الذات، استراتيجيات الوعي بالذات. كل هذه الاستراتيجيات أو أيضا التعلم التعاوني كلها أثبتت فاعليتها كاستراتيجيات تدريسية في الغرفة الصفية. مثل ما أنا عرضتكم النتائج عن مهارات التفكير العليا، أنا استخدمت استراتيجيات تدريس صفية قائمة على مهارات التعلم النشط التي من خلالها يتم توظيف الجانب الوجداني. يعني كان تركيزي على الجانب الوجداني في معظم طرائق وأساليب التدريس طوال فصل دراسي كامل. والتجربة أثبتت نجاحها بنسبة نجاح في مدرسة الأمل بلغت نسبة النجاح فيها 100% لما تم تطبيق استراتيجيات قائمة على الذكاء العاطفي أو الذكاء الوجداني، وهي مأخوذة من التعلم النشط القائم على تفعيل المشاعر والعواطف.
شكرا دكتورة زينب. Okay, we have 1 minute and 20 seconds.
شكرا دكتورة على إدارة الجلسة. أتوقع you can wrap up. يعطيك ألف عافية.
الله يعافيك. And if any of the presenters want to add anything in this minute?
I just would like to add that our project was funded by AlAjmi Foundation, and this is a symposium organized by them. So I'd like to thank them for the great support to the project.
Thank you.